Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dr. Judith Satina, a member of the Board of Trustees for the Cleveland Association of Phi Beta Kappa and a proud City Club member. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, the 10th Secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, Frederick M. Lawrence. The Phi Beta Kappa Society, commonly known as PBK, is the most prestigious academic honor society in the United States, known for promoting education in the liberal arts and sciences, fostering freedom of thought, and recognizing academic excellence. Since its inception in 1776, PBK has counted 17 presidents, 41 U.S. Supreme Court justices, and more than 140 Nobel laureates among its members. Frederick M. Lawrence became the 10th Secretary and CEO of PBK in 2016. An accomplished scholar, teacher, and attorney, Lawrence is one of the nation's leading experts on civil rights, free expression, and bias crimes. At Phi Beta Kappa, Lawrence has focused on advocacy for the arts, humanities, and sciences, championing free expression, free inquiry, and academic freedom, and invigorating the Society's 286 chapters and nearly 50 alumni associations. He is also a distinguished lecturer at the Georgetown Law Center and has previously served as president of Brandeis University, dean of the George Washington University Law School, and visiting professor and senior research scholar at Yale Law School. Lawrence received a bachelor's degree from Williams College, where he was elected to PBK, and a law degree from Yale Law School, where he was an editor of the Yale Law Journal. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming to the stage Frederick M. Lawrence.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you all for being here today. I'm sure I'm not the first speaker at the City Club who's had the experience of walking through the lobby, past all these pictures, and having just a little bit of imposter syndrome when you see who has spoken here. And part of me is thinking, Mrs. Lawrence, look what your son is doing. But it's a great honor to be here, and I feel fortified by the fact that I get to speak on behalf of the ancient and honorable Phi Beta Kappa Society that does in fact trace its roots back to the very early days of this new republic. And in fact, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. I am privileged to speak to you really in several different capacities. One is as an academic who has worked in the liberal arts and sciences for over 3 decades, so as a scholar, but also as an advocate. The subject of today's talk, what does it mean to advocate for the liberal arts and sciences, but also is as the 10th Secretary and CEO, as Judy kindly introduced me, of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. You realize that more people have walked on the moon than been Secretary of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. That's a fact. There are 12 people who've walked on the moon and only 10 of us who've held this position. Now, in all fairness, the first secretary does not go back to 1776. So those of you with pretty good math skills in your head are trying to do the arithmetic and figure out how is it possible we go back to 1776 and I'm only the 10th. But it does, in fact, go back to the founding of the modern structure of Phi Beta Kappa in 1883, when the first secretary is installed in office. So only the 10th since 1883, that's not half bad either. One of the ways in which we ground the goal, the function, the mission of advocating for liberal arts and sciences in Phi Beta Kappa will take us back to the founding. But before I go back to the founding, let me start very much in the present. Just the last few months, we finalized and adopted a new strategic plan, not so surprisingly, called Mapping the Future of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. It is a plan that is designed to take us up to the year 2026, which will be our 250th anniversary. Not a small thing for an honor society to last for a quarter of a millennium. The plan, which if you're interested, if you go to the pbk.org website, in the About PBK drop-down menu, there's a click for the strategic plan. But I'll summarize it for you in terms of three main focal points, and you'll see how it leads us to today's topic. One is the chapter experience. We have 290 chapters all across the country, including a number represented in this room, Case Western University nearby with the Alpha chapter of Ohio, and well represented in this room, is one of now 290 chapters. And so part of it we are focused on is how the campus life of Phi Beta Kappa can be enhanced, both the chapter itself and what the chapter can do for the university. I think it goes without saying to say that these are complicated, perhaps even perilous times on university campuses, and that among the great challenges is finding places where difficult conversations can take place. We at Phi Beta Kappa have been having difficult conversations for a long time, and so we are the place where difficult conversations can take place. Just as an example of that will again take us back into history a little bit. We have records of chapters that had debates in the 1810s, 1820s on the legality and morality of the slave trade and of slavery. And one can only imagine that when that topic was selected for a program, somebody, some well-meaning and well-intended person must have said, "Oh, can't we talk about something nice? Let's talk about Aristotle." And I imagine somebody else in the room must have said, "I think we ought to talk about what Aristotle would have talked about. So I think we better talk about the morality and legality of the slave trade." And so we go way back with conversations that are difficult to have being based in Phi Beta Kappa chapters, and that's a big piece of the chapter experience on campus. The second, which is quite relevant to many of you in the room and those watching on live feed, is the lifelong connection of our members who leave chapters as members of Phi Beta Kappa, do not become academics and go off to the four corners of the world literally, but remain engaged in the life of the arts and sciences. And so a second main prong is the lifelong connection through associations like the Cleveland Association, founded in 1947, and the other 49 associations, but all the other ways in which people can be involved. And of course, the third prong, which brings us to today, is advocacy for the liberal arts and sciences. Now, this is at one and the same time deep in the roots of Phi Beta Kappa, but it's also a little more complicated than you would think, because Phi Beta Kappa is, in fact, a nonpartisan organization. We are a 501c3, and as my outside counsel told me when I told him some of the ideas I had on coming in, he said, "If you succeed in losing our tax-exempt status, you will have had an unsuccessful run as secretary of Phi Beta Kappa." Well, that seemed like pretty good advice. So we are nonpartisan, and we take that seriously. I'm making light of it, but we do take it seriously. We have over 500,000 members, and they represent every conceivable political position. That said, there is such a thing as nonpartisan advocacy. And I think in the time in which we are living, nonpartisan advocacy sounds like an oxymoron. It is most decidedly not. It is very significant to be able to advocate for certain causes, not in a partisan way, but still in a very rigorous and vigorous kind of way. And that is the project of our advocacy for the liberal arts and sciences. So now, let me ground this even further back in the founding of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. It's a story that may be known to some of you. It's a story that is told at each induction ceremony, and this is high season for inductions. I did several inductions last week, and I'll be continue on the road with many more inductions coming. And we tell the story of the 5 undergraduates at the College of William and Mary who gathered in the Apollo Tavern, the Apollo Room of the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, Virginia, on the cold winter night of December 5th, 1776, and founded the Phi Beta Kappa Society. The problem when you tell the story is that it's so easy for it to kind of be lost in the mist of time, as if they were stock characters in a bad version of Hamilton, as if they all have these big collars and drink port and say things like, "Hear, hear." They were young people, just like our graduates today, living in a world that seemed quite uncertain, just like ours, and not at all sure how it was going to come out, just as many of us are not. And they feared for how the future might come out, and with good cause. Many of them would lose friends in the Revolutionary War. And it was not at all clear what the road was going to be. But we know several things about what happened on that night of December 5th, 1776. And one is that they adopted the new name of their organization, which, by the way, was not Phi Beta Kappa. The name of the organization was Societas Philosophia, or Philosophic Society, which is why if you have your Phi Beta Kappa key on you or at home, you know who you are. You will see on the back it says SP, that's why, Societas Philosophia. That was the name they adopted, and then they adopted a motto in Greek, Philosophia Biou Kubernetes, from which we take the name Phi Beta Kappa, the Greek initials of the motto. It was an astonishing motto to adopt, because in the midst of all that uncertainty, what they committed themselves to is that it would be the love of learning that would be, as we normally say, the guide to life. I'll come back to that translation in a second. The love of learning, not learning even itself, but the process, the love of learning, would be their guide. Not some dogma, not the crown, not any other source of authority, but that the process of learning is what they committed themselves to. Now, Kubernetes, from which we draw the English word governor, is usually translated as guide, but my classics colleagues, are there any classicists in the room? Oh, good, then I can make it up. My classics colleagues tell me that Kubernetes actually has a marine connotation, a nautical connotation. So in fact, a slightly better translation of Philosophia Biou Kubernetes would be love of learning is the pilot of life, the helmsperson of life. It is a subtle but important distinction, because the guide, you see, takes you on a path that already exists, whereas the pilot steers you out into the waters where there is no path. And sometimes the waters are choppy, as they were in 1776, and as they are today. And when the waters are choppy, what our founders committed themselves to is that it would be the love of learning that would be the pilot of their lives. Understood properly, even then, and in the 242 plus years since, this is a process of learning that looks out, that does not merely look in. It is not merely a process of thinking and discussing, but a process of understanding and of acting and of affecting the world in which they lived. And so I find our mission of nonpartisan advocacy for the arts and sciences in that founding moment, that founding night of December 5th, 1776. And it's a good thing to find this all the way back in our roots when we find ourselves in a time when the waters are choppy. I'm inspired by an important mentor of mine at the Yale Law School, the late Charles Black, who used to say, when being radical, use as much Latin as possible. Well, Greek in this case, not Latin. But the point's the same. We're not carving out a new mission. We're applying it in our time, but it's a mission that is ancient and honored. Let me come closer up to the present, but still 100 years ago, in fact, precisely 100 years ago. 1919, Dr. Edward Burge, who was the president of University of Wisconsin-Madison, was serving his term as the president of Phi Beta Kappa, what we call our board chair, essentially. Dr. Burge was addressing the society in 1919, reflecting back on the last time they had met in triennial convention. We have a 3-year cycle in Phi Beta Kappa. But you think about 1919, 3 years back would be 1916. That's before the United States went into World War I. To say that the world had changed in America in those 3 years barely captures the fundamental, earth-shaking kind of changes that had happened. A generation of young people went off to Europe, not all of whom came back. And those of whom came back included many, most, maybe all, who were changed fundamentally and who changed the society they came back to. So Burge was looking out at a Phi Beta Kappa in 1919 and thinking about its connection with 1916, and he talked about the fundamental faith of Phi Beta Kappa. Here's what he said. The fundamental faith of Phi Beta Kappa is in the inexhaustible value of the accumulated experience of the human race as a guide to wise action in all relations of life. This experience is developed in science, recorded in history, and embodied in literature. All permanent social gains flow out of it and are based upon it. All leadership that promises secure advance rests with those to whom the worth of the past is as clear as the vision of the future. I'll come back at the end to how Burge concluded his remarks. But he was thinking of a Phi Beta Kappa in 1919 that had to be part of this changing world, not just to understand the past, but to have a vision of the future. Now, when we think about examples of how Phi Beta Kappa has been involved in nonpartisan advocacy, there are a number I could choose, and we can talk about additional ones during the question-answer period. But the best one to seize on, the signature legislative accomplishment of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, takes us back to the early 1960s, where Phi Beta Kappa was integrally involved in the creation of the National Endowments for the Arts and the Humanities. 1963, Phi Beta Kappa, along with the American Council of Learned Societies and the Council of Graduate Schools in America, co-sponsored what was called the National Commission on the Humanities. It was a convening of scholars who gathered to talk about what America might commit itself to in the arts and humanities. It led to a recommendation in 1964 to create National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities, which itself led to legislation that President Johnson signed into law in September of 1965. I commend to you to go on YouTube and find President Johnson's remarks at the signing of the legislation creating the National Endowments for the Humanities and the Arts. It is inspiring in the deepest way, not in spite of the fact that President Johnson did not have what many of us would recognize as a liberal arts education or even much of a college education at all, but because of that. Had it come during the time of or been signed by his predecessor with his Harvard education, it certainly would have been inspiring. And I don't doubt that President Kennedy, with his commitment to the arts and humanities, would have given a beautiful speech. But to hear it come from someone who grew up dirt poor and never had the benefits of an education, and for him to talk about what it meant for a great society, to use that term that he was using in other parts of social legislation at the time, for a great society to be committed to the arts and humanities is inspiring. In fact, let me give you some language from the legislation itself. Now, typically, if a law professor starts to read from a statute, that's a pretty good time for people to pull out their cell phones. But stay with me here. Stay with me here, and I assure you, you don't hear language like this in legislation very often. Section 1 of the legislation, not a single hereto or wherefore in the clause. The arts and the humanities belong to all the people of the United States. What an extraordinary, clarion, ringing endorsement of to whom the arts and humanities belong. Not to the artists and the humanists, not to the museums and the universities to all the people of the United States. Section 6 says the arts and humanities reflect the high place accorded by the American people to the nation's rich cultural heritage and to the fostering of mutual respect for the diverse beliefs and values of all persons and all groups. And perhaps my favorite section, Section 8 of the legislation, which says, the world leadership that has come to the United States. I'm going to read that again slowly. The world leadership that has come to the United States cannot rest solely upon superior power, superior wealth, or superior technology, but must be solidly founded upon worldwide respect and admiration for the nation's high qualities as a leader in the realm of ideas and the realm of the spirit. So that's what it meant to endorse a national commitment to the arts and humanities, and that came out of a commitment to a nonpartisan effort involving Phi Beta Kappa and others, a bipartisan effort in terms of what happened on the Hill, to endorse this direction. And in fact, the votes were overwhelming in both the House and the Senate, and perhaps even more to the point, there were positive yay votes among both Democrats and Republicans, and there were negative nay votes among both Democrats and Republicans. It was not what we've become so used to of party line votes on legislation. But again, to go back and forth in time, these ringing words of the enabling legislation for the NEA and the NEH echo back to the early days of the Republic, 2 centuries earlier, when George Washington, addressing the first Congress, said the following: "The assembly to which I address myself is too enlightened not to be fully sensible how much a flourishing state of the arts and sciences contributes to national prosperity and national reputation." Washington, in some ways, is the only nonpartisan, bipartisan president we have. Even under his tenure of office, the party system was beginning to occur and split. And so you have the likes of Jefferson as Secretary of State, who will lead one party, and Adams as Vice President, who will lead another party. But Washington himself could be honestly described as a nonpartisan president. And he goes before Congress and talks about the role of the arts and sciences and its role in a national prosperity and national reputation. Now, I don't share all this with you in some nostalgia for a lost time of consensus, but rather to inspire to what nonpartisan advocacy for the arts and sciences can look like and what it can achieve. Let's go 20 years after the creation of the NEA and the NEH. In the early 1980s, for the first time, you have a discussion about defunding the NEA and the NEH, something that has come back in our own time that I'll turn to in a moment. At that time, Phi Beta Kappa and a number of other organizations in the not-for-profit space create something called the National Humanities Alliance. National Humanities Alliance remains one of the core advocacy groups with respect to the humanities. We were among the founders. My predecessor, John Churchill, the 9th Secretary, served as the chair of the board of the National Humanities Alliance. I'm privileged now to serve on the executive committee of the National Humanities Alliance. The National Humanities Alliance was born of the struggle to maintain the NEA and the NEH in the early 1980s. Successfully so. Now, think about what that means to be engaged in nonpartisan advocacy. It gives us a good example of what would be partisan versus nonpartisan. During that period of the Reagan administration, the head of the National Endowment of Humanities was Lynn Cheney, the wife of the future vice president. She may be your cup of tea, she may not be your cup of tea. Whether or not one would pick her as the chair of the National Endowment of the Humanities, that is a partisan decision, and that is something on which Phi Beta Kappa would have no opinion and should have no opinion. Do we have personal opinions? I'm sure there are many personal opinions across the spectrum of people in the National and Humanities Alliance world, and certainly among the Phi Beta Kappa population. Some would be very pleased and some less pleased and some outright opposed. That would be a partisan debate. What is not a partisan debate, What is nonpartisan advocacy is to say that there should be a national endowment for the humanities, that there should be a national endowment for the arts. And that was a successful effort in the 1980s, throughout that period, and on again into our time. In our own time, the issue comes back with the first budget proposal of the administration in the winter of 2017, which is to say 2 years ago right now, a budget proposal that called again for defunding the NEA and the NEH. So the National Endowment for the Humanities was again on the potential chopping block, causing many groups, including the National Humanities Alliance, to play a formative role in that. I am pleased to say that we and others in the Humanities Alliance achieved a spectacular success in not only seeing to it that the national endowments were not defunded, but that a little bit of Washington wonk talk coming up. So for people who, if your heart goes pity-pat talking about fiscal years, you're going to like this stuff. If it doesn't, just bear with me. But we live in two spaces, we advocates for the arts and sciences, in the trenches as well as in the more philosophical. The original budget that finally, budget is sort of the funny word for it because we didn't have a formal budget the first year, but the allocations actually restored full allocation to the NEA and the NEH in fiscal year 2018 and fiscal year 2019, which actually does have a budget now, and for those of you who follow these things, you know how close it came to not quite. But fiscal year 19, there was actually a small increase in the endowments funding. So now we are in the process, right now, of talking about what should happen for fiscal year 2020, that is to say the fiscal year that will begin this October. The administration's budget proposal again calls for defunding the NEA and the NEH. The difference is that at this point, no one takes it seriously, and I don't mean that critically. It's that everybody understands that it is a political position, not a budget proposal. The experience that I and my colleagues, and I should introduce both Laura and Nora, not all of my staff have rhyming names, but they do. Laura, who's Deputy Director of Chapters and Associations, Nora with us working in the advocacy space, knows from her own work on the Hill and from my time advocating for the arts and humanities on the Hill, that it is not seen as a liberal or conservative issue. It is, in the words of President Washington, an American commitment. My niche, as it were, in the NHA, the National Humanities Alliance world, is Republican members of the House and Senate in the last Congress, where the Republicans controlled the majority, both House and Senate, who were members of Phi Beta Kappa. I have to tell you, these are very unusual conversations for an advocate to have, because I'm not coming in as a K Street lobbyist with a 2x4 in my hand. I'm coming into the room as the Secretary of the Honor Society to which this senator or this member of Congress belongs. And I have to tell you, these have not been difficult conversations, and there has been strong bipartisan support precisely because there is an understanding of the role of the arts and humanities, both for the spiritual life of the nation and for the economic life of the nation. I'm sure that Congressman Chuck Fleischman from Tennessee would not mind my repeating a story of a conversation with him. Congressman Fleischman is a proud Phi Beta from University of Illinois, not Champaign-Urbana, not all that far from here, who is a Republican of pretty strong conservative credentials. Nonetheless, he finished my sentences when I started telling him about what the multiplier effect was of money spent by the National Endowment for the Humanities in his district. See, it turns out that the Bessie Smith archives are in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And it turns out without NEH funding, there aren't going to be any Bessie Smith archives. So who cares about that? Well, people who love music care about that. People who care about American studies and American culture care about that. But you know who else cares about it? The person who owns the coffee shop across the street from the archives, and the person with the restaurant down the street, and the person who sells the products that the restaurant and the coffee shop use. That's how you get a multiplier effect. Chuck Fleischman understood all that. So all of that working together is what made for successful nonpartisan advocacy efforts for the NEA and the NEH. Within the last 18 months or so, similar efforts have been very successful in increasing allocations for supplemental education grants, federal work-study programs, funding for historically black colleges and universities, and funding for Hispanic-serving institutions. None of this is to say, and therefore we've received good results, so you should all enjoy the rest of your lunch and all our work is done. Quite the contrary. I haven't quite shifted to decaf yet myself. There's plenty of work that has to be done, and none of these accomplishments stay stuck. They're all involved in, as Mr. Jefferson said, eternal vigilance. That is the price not only of liberty, that is the price of most advocacy. When we ground where our drive for our nonpartisan work comes from, it does, piece on Charles Black, come from the Latin. It does come from going back to 1776, but it does require regrounding in our core values. The mission of the liberal arts that the 5 founders on the night of December 5th, 1776 committed them to is a commitment to the pursuit of knowledge inherited, discovered, and created, and the transmission of that knowledge, and understanding that it produces important results on each of 3 levels. The one we talk about the most, a meaningful life, understanding where one sits in the world when one contemplates the great questions of what is the meaning of life, what does it mean to live a good life, what does it mean to have a good society, that we are not alone in asking those questions, that we share those questions with those around the world and through the centuries, back millennia, to walk into a space, whether it's an outdoor space or a cathedral, and to read the space, to hear a piece of music and to understand where that places us in time. That is what it means to live a meaningful life. But that's not the only thing that a liberal arts education provides. It also provides the groundwork for a productive life. In a world that changes so quickly, where if I say to students, you're being prepared not for your first or second career, but for your 10th or 15th career, it never fails. The parents in the room totally freak out. The young people in the room do not. They expect that. They expect to be learning how to learn. They expect to have to be trained to be problem solvers, to be information analysts, to be communicators, those kinds of trans-contextual skills that will be necessary no matter how things change. That is what they committed themselves back to in 1776, and that is a forward-looking mission that requires us to be advocates not only for the humanities and the arts, but for the relevance and vitality of liberal arts education in a time when, to say the least, it is often underappreciated and sometimes outright under attack. It is also what requires us to be advocates for free expression and robust free expression on our campuses, as well as robust protection for academic freedom and the understanding that our campuses will be able to produce the work of liberal arts when it is faculty who control the 4 core pieces that the Supreme Court articulated over half a century ago that are the essence of academic freedom. Who studies here? Who teaches here? What they teach and how they teach it. Those are core academic functions, and academic freedom and faculty governance are the core of our academic institutions. Our advocacy, therefore, is on our campuses, and our advocacy is out into the world. It is on our campuses when we look at issues about academic freedom and brings Phi Beta Kappa to being one of the parties to an amicus curiae, a friend of the court brief, in the Harvard admissions litigation. Not on the side of Harvard and not opposed to Harvard, but on the side of academic freedom and faculty governance, which is to say, as the brief articulated, the core function of determining how is a class best comprised is one that is best left to the university itself. What does it mean to produce the best student body for a learning environment for all of them is a core academic function. Advocacy for free inquiry and free expression brings us to contemporary issues such as the executive order on free expression on campus. If the order is about purporting to support free expression, then obviously we are happy to endorse that. To the extent that it is excessively vague and therefore could paradoxically limit free expression on campus, then we are opposed. I had the opportunity to testify before the Government Operations Committee in the last Congress precisely on legislation on removing federal funding for free expression on campus. And one of the most remarkable pieces, this was a panel that was left, right, and center. And trust me, the left meant pretty far left and the right meant pretty far right. We at Phi Beta Kappa, of course, had it precisely right in the middle. What we all agreed on, and we disagreed on many important things, what we all agreed on is this was a bad subject for legislation. It is certainly a good subject for aspirational setting of goals and shared commitments, but it is a bad subject for brittle tools and for legislation. We trace this not to a recent mission. We trace this to our original mission, to that night in 1776. I told you I would come back to President Burge's last conclusion of that comment, so let me conclude my remarks with that. Recall that Burge was talking about the fundamental faith of Phi Beta Kappa, and he said it was in the inexhaustible value of the accumulated experience of the human race as a guide to wise actions in all human life. Here's how he concluded. But the faith of Phi Beta Kappa, he said, is no mere conservative force limiting progress and controlling its advance. We believe in our motto, he said. We cognize philosophy as the pilot of life, not concerned to keep the ship in harbor, but to guide it safely through dangerous waters. The problem, therefore, for us today, both as individuals and as a society, and I do believe he meant the double entendre of a Phi Beta Kappa society and an American society. The problem, therefore, for us today, both as individuals and as a society, is to make our faith active and effective in the changing world around us. I think what President Burge said 100 years ago remains absolutely true. Indeed, I would say when it comes time to think of making our faith active and effective in the changing world around us, then now more than ever. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions.
Today, we are listening to a forum with Frederick M. Lawrence, the 10th Secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via our live stream. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. Holding the microphone today is Content Coordinator Bliss Davis. May we have the first question, please?
Okay, how is there been much outreach of Phi Beta Kappa to immigrant students, and how can this help them later in life?
A question of whether there's been outreach to immigrant students. One of the inspiring things of Phi Beta Kappa is that among our core missions has been recognizing the most successful, accomplished students at those schools that are committed to the arts and sciences. In some ways, that's the mission that people most focus on. I suspect that many of you and some of the people listening were, I hope, interested and inspired to hear a lot of what Phi Beta Kappa does that you might not know that we did. But the one thing you certainly know that we do is we give these keys out for people who graduate at or near the top of their classes at one of the fewer than 10% of the colleges and universities that have chapters of Phi Beta Kappa. That gives you the opportunity with some clarity to be able to say, this is what the best looks like if given the opportunity. So we, of course, make no distinction as to national origin or alienage of students who have done the work and accomplished at the highest level. But perhaps one good example is the best way to make the point. Trinity University in Washington, D.C., there are a number of Trinities in the country. This is Trinity in Washington, D.C. Last year elected 13 new members of Phi Beta Kappa. 7 of the 13 were dreamers. This is what happens when you give opportunity to people regardless of race, creed, color, national origin, alienage, sexual orientation, identity, or any other category, and let them have at it. And if I may say so, that is what it means to make this country great.
Thank you for your very comprehensive and interesting remarks today. You spoke mostly about liberal arts and the humanities. I wonder whether you could speak briefly about the sciences in
Sure.
terms of Phi Beta Kappa activities.
Sure. We often say liberal arts and sciences. We advocate for the liberal arts and sciences. My scientist colleagues will routinely say, you do realize that's redundant, and of course it is. You know, the liberal arts, properly understood, include the natural sciences, include mathematics. We say liberal arts and sciences because typically when you say to people liberal arts, they think the humanities and arts. Sometimes they mean social sciences, sometimes they don't even think social sciences. We mean liberal arts in the more encompassing sense. So we are in partnership, for example, with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We have been involved in efforts to maintain research funding for the sciences. I'm glad to say that in the same results of the last 2 years we talked about with the NEA and the NEH in certain higher education areas, there has been increased funding, not back to the equivalent level about 15 years ago in terms of buying value, current dollar value for science research, but increases, and this also is under assault is probably too strong, but there is some level of concern as to whether that will continue. We were among the founding sponsors of the March for Science 2 years ago. And this is actually another good example to highlight the difference between partisan advocacy and nonpartisan advocacy, because we were looked to play a role in a number of different marches. For example, we did not formally endorse the Women's March, which took place the morning after or the day after the inauguration in 2017. It's not that there weren't many values that we shared in common, it's that I think that march was properly understood as a partisan march. That was a march that was a reaction to the election of a particular president, and there are those in my staff and in the Phi Beta Kappa world who agreed with that, and there are those, I'm sure, who were opposed to it. But that's why Phi Beta Kappa, qua Phi Beta Kappa, did not endorse that march. The March for Science we did, and I can tell you there was some pushback on that, because some people thought that was a partisan thing to be doing. I don't think commitment to the scientific method, I don't think commitment to fact-based analysis, I don't think commitment to federal support for scientific institutions is a partisan position. That is the same kind of set of issues that we talked about in the humanities and arts areas. So we were engaged from the beginning in the March for Science as well. Finally, I mean, there are many other examples, but finally, one of the core projects we've had for over 60 years now is the Visiting Scholar Program. Some of you have undoubtedly seen Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholars who go out around the country to different campuses and give public lectures and also teach classes on campus. In fact, if I may give a small plug, we introduced a year ago a podcast that I do with each of the visiting scholars over the course of the year, one episode a month called Key Conversations with Phi Beta Kappa. So for those of you who actually listen to podcasts on your way to work, driving or walking, or however you do on the treadmill, however you listen to your podcasts, I encourage you to listen to Key Conversations with Phi Beta Kappa. The visiting scholars always cover the full spectrum of the arts and sciences, including the natural sciences. So every year we have a number of people in each of those areas. In fact, having mentioned Key Conversations, on Monday, the next episode that goes live is not with a visiting scholar, but is 3 of us in conversation talking about the admissions scandal. Oh, that goes live on April 1st. There, that did it, huh?
Hi there, thanks for being here. Could you talk a little bit about the history of Phi Beta Kappa and perhaps the changes that you've had to go through as an organization after being around for, a quarter of a millennia, and perhaps how the values within the arts and sciences have allowed Phi Beta Kappa to be flexible and last for so long? Thanks.
Thank you. It's a great question. There are similarities in the mission that trace all the way back to 1776, and then there are things that have allowed us to change. In fact, I would say have forced us to change. So let's start with one pretty basic one. I say 5 undergraduates of the College of William and Mary gathered in the Apollo room of the Raleigh Tavern. That is completely true. Would you like to guess their gender and ethnicity? And this part's not quite so pleasant or clever. 5 undergraduates of the College of William and Mary in 1776. Would you like to guess what was among the assets of some of those young men or their families? Right? There's no question that they had enslaved people in their families. So that's the start, right? The nub of the love of learning will be the pilot of our lives, then forces a kind of conversation. And it's not a straight line. So, of course, I gave a good example of being willing to take on the issue of the slave trade in the 1820s and 1830s. That's at Union College, the Phi Beta Kappa chapter. Union is the Alpha of New York, one of our oldest chapters. One of the members of that chapter is a guy named William Seward, who later goes on to almost be president in 1860, Secretary of State under President Lincoln and President Johnson. He was, I think, was a student officer of the chapter and undoubtedly played a role in some of what was going on at that chapter. But certainly there is a more problematic part of our history. Our first African-American members not till 1875. Women are not elected till the 1870s. The efforts that drive us to this very day, the most recent stop on this very important journey, last summer, where we had the most recent triennial gathering of delegates from all of the chapters and associations of Phi Beta Kappa. It was in Boston this last summer. Adopted with strong, enthusiastic encouragement from the administration, a resolution of diversity and inclusion for Phi Beta Kappa, which means looking out to how we are structured. Are there barriers that we have put in, certainly not intentionally anymore, but inadvertently, that have to be removed? We have among our base of schools, 290 schools, 4 historically black colleges and universities, Howard, Morehouse, Spelman, and Fisk. I will just make a prediction that I come back here at some point in the future, I'll say it's more than 4. I'm not at liberty to say more than that right now, but that certainly is something we look at. We have expanded the base of our schools over those 242 years dramatically. So if you look at our 290 schools in Phi Beta Kappa, roughly a third are small standalone liberal arts schools, which is what most people think of when they think of Phi Beta Kappa. Another third are large private universities, and fully a third are state universities. Now, some of those state universities are what are known as the so-called public Ivies, schools like University of Michigan or Cal Berkeley. But many of them are the non-flagships, and many of them are schools that have a overwhelmingly socioec 1, first generation in their family to go to college population. Over the next week. Next week I do the installation of the new chapter at Mississippi State University and University of South Florida. The kinds of students that they will bring to us as new members will dramatically broaden, our base. Give you one little piece or insight on Mississippi State, for example. Now, you're not to repeat this to anybody because this is going to be in my induction comments, and when I do it, I want people to be charmingly surprised when they hear it. So I don't want you running around, and of course we're taping the whole thing, so I don't know how quiet I expect this to be. Mississippi State is a university that has developed a strong commitment to the liberal arts and sciences in a state when, to say the least, has not been that easy. And the president of that university has had to deal with a state administration that has not always been so understanding of what that university is trying to do. That university is the site of the archives of Ulysses S. Grant. So, as I intend to say in Starkville next week, I'm not so presumptuous to know what the world to come is going to look like, but it's going to look a little bit like that, right? In a place where the vanquished and the victor not just celebrate together, but study together. If we can do that, then we're doing something important.
Thank you for being here. Ohio has a rich tradition of small liberal arts colleges, such as Kenyon and Hiram and Oberlin and Denison and Tiffin and Heidelberg and Ursuline and many more than that have enriched our country. I'm just curious what your sense of is, while their mission may be the same as 100 years ago, times change, but what do you portend for their future contributions to our country?
Yeah, and many of those schools, not all of them, many of them have chapters. 15 chapters in Ohio, is that what we found? And it's everything from the small standalone liberal arts that you mentioned to a small liberal arts college called Ohio State University down the freeway, and a lot in between. I think this is a very challenging time for small liberal arts schools. The small liberal arts schools, like the one I was privileged to attend, that have very large endowments will be fine. You know, they will survive. The ones that have smaller endowments, and particularly the ones that are largely tuition-driven, are in a time of great challenge. And I think that a lot of attention has to be paid to how that can be handled, or else something very precious in American higher education could be lost. Not lost entirely, I'm not going to be an alarmist here. But one of the great things about American higher education is the just mind-numbing diversity of the higher education ecosystem. So much broader than any other country in the world. But that may not stand up all on its own. So that when you see schools like a Hampshire college in Massachusetts talking about looking for a merger partner, didn't say they're planning on merging with XYZ institution, looking for a merger partner. That's a tough strategy for trying to find a merger partner, and announcing they're not taking an incoming freshman class. So I won't call that a red flag, but that's a yellow and maybe orange flag that they have put up. So how do we make sure that those kinds of institutions can survive? I think some level of merger probably is a healthy thing. Not all of them will be able to survive on their own. I think some attention to collaboration and consortia among schools will be an important thing. I can tell you, during my tenure as president of Brandeis, which began in 2011, but we were still feeling the aftershocks of the 08-09 crash, one of the things that finally happened is universities got together to talk about, in a serious way, collaborating and cost sharing. I mean, some of it is the kind of thing that makes anybody in the business world to say, that's great that you're doing it, but that's the first time you guys have thought about that? Like, why don't you have a consortium of schools in the Boston area, which is so rich in schools? Ohio could certainly do this. A consortium of schools buying your life insurance together, your health insurance together, buying your paper together, buying your paper towel together. I mean, all of this stuff sounds prosaic. Yeah, the prosaic stuff is what takes the water from here down to here and lets you survive. How about in the academic house? Does it make sense for every school to be teaching 12 or 15 or 20 languages? No. Therefore, we shouldn't be teaching foreign languages. That would be a disaster. I mean, from the point of view of Phi Beta Kappa, it's totally inconsistent with one of our core requirements. But to me, as an academician, it would be a disaster if we ever stopped teaching foreign languages in American universities. So how do you deal with that? Well, maybe you have a consortium that says, here are the schools that are better off teaching these, and some of the school teaching those. We at least need to be able to think those ways. Last and foremost, I put it out of order on purpose, last and foremost is the need for maintained and indeed increased federal and state support for higher education. And the idea of talking about reducing support for student loans, reducing support for financial aid, and reducing supports for higher education is not only, for all the philosophical reasons I've been sharing with you, inconsistent with that core mission that Lyndon Johnson talked about, that George Washington talked about, but it's also inconsistent with the mission of a country that intends to continue to grow and be a leading economic juggernaut. We have, to paraphrase that section of the enabling legislation for the NEA and the NEH, in my view, we have been the most powerful country in the world, not because we had the strongest economy and not because we had the most weapons, it's because we always had the best ideas. And God help us if we ever stop having the best ideas.
So my question builds off that gentleman's question. With a lot of City Club speakers talking about the decline of support for liberal arts, are any of the ideas you just presented being given to liberal arts colleges so that they can survive? And what role does PBK play if we continue to see a decline in support for liberal arts and a focus much more on science and engineering and sort of what people call tangible careers?
You know, I think that we can play a role both on our own campus campuses with our chapters and more broadly to advocate for the vitality and the role of liberal arts education and making the argument that it is precisely what's necessary for what we say a meaningful life, a productive life, and also an engaged life. We know graduates of liberal arts schools vote in higher levels, register to vote in higher levels. That's not the only way to measure civic engagement, but it's a kind of surrogate for civil engagement. A self-governing people, a democratic society, requires that nature of involvement. It requires people who are able to engage in debate and be part of political discussions, they're able to analyze discussions. So yes, we have pushed that out as part of what we say to our chapters on campus to play a role in that. Yes, in my annual communications with the presidents of all of our chapters, of universities that host our chapters, I push that out. And yes, in my discussions with members of Congress. I also hope that some meaningful percentage of our 500,000 members talk about that, because we are in fact not a cross-section. We are in fact a group of people who are disproportionately located in the nearer the levers of power. And with that comes great responsibility. But I think right now, the undercutting of the value of the liberal arts is one that hits on each of those levels. It will ultimately undercut what it means to be a meaningful society, but it will also undercut our productivity, and it will also undercut our ability to be engaged. Just coming back to productivity for a second, because that one sometimes goes by too fast. Let me just give a couple of quick examples. Facebook is having some significant problems as a corporation right now. Does anybody think the answer to Facebook's problems is to have more and better coders? Right? That's not where their challenges are coming from. They have that. I'm not being facetious. They have extraordinarily gifted computer scientists and computer engineers. That's not what they're missing. Right? They need philosophers. They need sociologists. They need social psychologists. They need historians. Right? That's where they're missing. And that's not because it makes me feel better. That's bottom line, that it will help them. There are data showing that the best predictor of a six-figure salary within X number of years of graduation, again, that's not the only way of measuring productivity, but it's a kind of measure of something. Number of courses taken outside of one's major field. Now, who'd have known that? Well, the answer is because if on the day that you graduate, you were bound by that body of knowledge to try to make a career, talk about a fool's errand. What the exact things that you've learned are becoming obsolete as you go. Hell, I had to use a slide rule in high school. And it's actually an interesting example, because by the time I was a senior in high school, 2 years after I took sophomore chemistry as a sophomore in high school, the first HP calculators came out. And it went from everybody had a slide rule to nobody had a slide rule, like that. So if what I had learned was how to use a slide rule, I would have learned nothing of value. But if, as my teacher said, you're learning where to put the decimal point, then I learned something valuable. Right? Basic, pure research drives all aspects of our society, or as Jonas Salk said, but for basic science, instead of inventing the vaccine, I would have invented a really efficient iron lung, because that's what they thought was the best way to treat polio. But somebody was thinking about something that causes a guy like Salk to say, I think we could actually use this here. So is that about a meaningful life, a productive life, or an engaged life? Yeah, that's what the liberal arts are about. It's all three. Thank you all.
Today at the City Club, we have been listening to a forum with Frederick M. Lawrence, the 10th Secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. Today's presentation is the Cleveland Association of Phi Beta Kappa Endowed Forum, made possible by a generous grant from the Cleveland Association of Phi Beta Kappa. Today's talk is the sixth in a series of compelling presentations on current topics of interest. We have many representatives from the association with us today. We're grateful for your support of City Club programming. Lastly, we welcome guests at a table or tables hosted by Baker Hostetler. We thank all of you for being here today. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.